Welcome to the Good White Folks Podcast, your trusted source for counter-racism news and analysis. Powered by Planetary Chess and cutting-edge AI, we deliver sharp insights into the state of white supremacy to keep you informed and empowered.
All right, welcome back, everyone. We're diving into some seriously heavy stuff this week. We're looking at these newsletters, right?
Yeah.
And they're all about tracking white supremacist activity.
Yeah. And not just listing off incidents, they're going deep, analyzing it all through this critical race theory lens.
And this is where it gets really interesting, right? They've got this thing called the State of White Supremacy Meter.
Yeah, the meter, it's kind of wild. They use it to track, the volume of incidents, how severe they are, and the overall impact.
And to do that, they're pulling from the work of these super influential Black intellectuals.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, Dr. Amos Wilson.
Heavy hitters for sure. And get this, the meter's been hovering around 74% for the past week.
Which, that's pretty alarming.
Yeah, no kidding. Definitely a lot to unpack there.
So let's jump into some of the specific events these newsletters are highlighting.
December 9th, the meter's at 73.8%.
Okay, set the scene for us. What's going down?
Well, Trump's out there promising to pardon the January 6th rioters, if he gets reelected.
Typical Trump, right?
Yeah, you'd think so. But the newsletter, it doesn't just dismiss it as a stunt. It connects this whole pardon thing to Dr. Wilson's work.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, Dr. Wilson, he talked about how institutions, especially the legal system, they're designed to protect the powerful.
Right.
So this pardon promise, it's not just about letting those rioters off the hook, it's sending a message.
That the system will shield those who uphold white supremacy, even if they break the law.
Bingo.
Wow. Okay, what else is happening on December 9th?
There's this story about a protest leader in Sydney getting arrested.
Okay.
And the newsletter, they link this back to Dr. Welsing's idea of white genetic survival panic.
Okay, that one's a bit intense. Remind me what that's all about.
Basically, it's the idea that when white dominance is even slightly challenged, there's this huge backlash.
So like a defense mechanism.
Exactly, like a cornered animal. So arresting this protest leader, it's about silencing dissent before it can even gain any traction.
Makes you think. All right, what else is on the radar?
Well, there's a piece discussing the movie adaptation of The Nickel Boys.
Oh, yeah, that book was brutal.
Yeah, it exposed the horrific abuse that went down in this racist reform school.
And the newsletter is saying?
They're saying these institutions, they haven't gone away. They've just evolved.
Into the modern prison system.
Which targets and harms Black people disproportionately. It's all connected to our history. And Dr. Wilson's work helps us see how these systems of oppression, how they stay in place over time.
It's like this deeply ingrained pattern that keeps repeating itself.
Exactly. Then there's this letter, some dude trying to claim that Trump's victory wasn't about white supremacy.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, right. He's saying it was about breaking from Marxism. Give me a break.
Classic deflection tactic.
The newsletter calls him out hard. Straight up says it's Maggie representing white genetic survival panic in its purest form.
It's like they're trying to gaslight us into thinking race and power aren't even factors.
Totally. Black Lives Matter leaders are speaking out about the Daniel Penny case, the one where he choked that Black homeless man to death and got off scot-free.
That case was infuriating.
The newsletter argues that this is just another example of the system protecting white supremacy.
Because they see Penny as upholding that white power structure.
Yeah, and it goes even deeper. They talk about how the system tries to discredit anyone who calls this stuff out.
Branding them as unhinged or radical, just for stating the truth.
It's textbook Dr. Wilson, right?
Yeah.
The silencing tactic, it's how they maintain the status quo.
All right, so December 9th is already a pretty wild ride.
Oh, buckle up. It gets even more intense as the week goes on.
Let's hear it. What's going down on December 10th?
The meter creeps up to 74.6%. And we've got this Christian nationalist movement in Oklahoma. They're straight up calling for war.
War? What are they even talking about?
Who knows? But the newsletter, they don't hesitate. They call it exactly what it is.
Yeah.
White supremacy hiding behind religion.
Which actually ties in with Dr. Wilson's work, right? You warned us about this.
Totally. White supremacy often uses religious language to justify its agenda.
Makes it seem all righteous and God-ordained.
Exactly. It's a way to legitimize bigotry. Then we've got Charlemagne Tygod calling out the Democratic Party.
Oh, really? What for?
Being full of shit when it comes to immigration. The newsletter sees this as evidence that both parties are ultimately serving the same system.
Just with different branding.
Like Coke and Pepsi.
Same capitalist bullshit.
And according to Dr. Wilson, both parties end up upholding white supremacy, whether they admit it or not.
It's about power, not representing the people.
Right on.
So we've got white supremacy masquerading as religion. We've got both political parties complicit in the system. What else?
The UK media is straight up biased against Muslims, no surprise there. But the newsletter connects this to Dr. Welsing's analysis of global white supremacy.
It's a reminder that this isn't just an American problem.
Global system of oppression targets anyone who doesn't fit the white supremacist mold.
And it's scary how quickly things can escalate, right? Because then we see
chatter about Magi already trying to control Trump's potential cabinet picks before the election results are even final.
wow, they're not wasting any time.
The newsletter sees this as a clear sign that they're already scheming to consolidate power. It goes back to Dr. Wilson's work, how the system ensures its survival by controlling these key institutions.
Like a virus infecting the host.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's like they're playing 3D chess while the rest of us are struggling to keep up.
Totally. And it's not just about subtle influence either.
What do you mean?
The Heritage Foundation, they're launching this thing called Project Esther.
Project Esther sounds ominous.
Oh, it is their stated goal. Crushing dissent, straight up.
No more messing around, huh?
The newsletter sees this as a direct response to the growing resistance against white supremacy.
It's like they're panicking.
Dr. Welsing talked about how white supremacy gets more aggressive when it feels threatened. This is exactly that. They're not even trying to hide it anymore.
Just straight up intimidation tactics.
Then, to top it all off, Representative Bowman, he speaks out against white supremacy.
Good for him.
And immediately gets slammed with backlash. Textbook system response, according to the newsletter.
They can't handle anyone challenging their power.
Dr. Wilson was right on the money when he said the system reacts violently to any threat to his dominance. It's like they're saying, stay in your lane or we'll take you down.
So even though the meter dipped slightly on December 11th, down to 74%.
The shitstorm is still raging.
Give me the highlights.
Well, that UK media bias story, it's back in the headlines. The newsletter emphasizes how they use the media to demonize anyone who threatens white dominance.
It's all about controlling the narrative.
Dr. Welsing's work on psychological warfare is so relevant here. It's all fueled by that white genetic survival panic.
They need to create an enemy.
And that story about Magi influencing Trump's potential cabinet. Also back.
Shocker.
The newsletter keeps hammering this point home, how the system stays in control by stacking those positions with its people.
Like a self-perpetuating cycle.
Dr. Wilson warned us about this. It's how they ensure the survival of white supremacy. Always thinking 3 moves ahead.
So even if the players change, the game stays the same.
Pretty much. Then we've got these anti-immigration protests in Ireland.
Oh, wow. So it's not just the UK.
The newsletter uses this to show how global this whole thing is.
White supremacy. It's a worldwide problem.
They argue that these protests, they're a symptom of that white genetic survival panic spreading, just like Dr. Welsing predicted.
Like a disease.
Highly contagious. And Rep. Bowman's back in the news, too. Still getting attacked.
They're simply speaking the truth.
The newsletter connects this back to Dr. Wilson. It's a textbook example of the system shutting down anyone who dares to challenge its power. You can't call out the evil of white supremacy without consequences.
It's like they're trying to make an example of him, to scare others into silence.
Totally. Then there's a story about Wall Street freaking out over the potential economic impact of a Magi comeback.
Makes sense. A lot of those financial institutions have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo.
The newsletter ties this into the bigger picture, though, showing how economics and white supremacy are all intertwined.
It's not just about ideology. It's about who holds the money.
Dr. Wilson was brilliant on this point. Economic control is a major tool of white supremacy. It's how they keep the power in the hands of the few.
So it's not just about racist attitudes. It's about controlling the resources.
Yep. Then we've got research coming out about the generational trauma caused by systemic racism.
That's heavy stuff, but crucial to understand.
The newsletter connects this back to Dr. Welsing, all about the deep psychological wounds inflicted by white supremacy.
It's not just a current event. It's a legacy of oppression that keeps hurting people, generation after generation.
Right. And then December 12th rolls around. The meter dips again to 73%. But the news, it's still a dumpster fire.
What's the top story this time?
Surge in white supremacist activity following Trump's victory. The newsletter links it straight back to Dr. Welsing's concept of white genetic survival panic.
They feel emboldened, right?
Yeah.
Like they've been given permission to be even more openly racist.
Totally. And the Daniel Penny case. Back in the news. Black lawmakers and activists are calling out the verdict.
As a blatant example of white supremacy in the justice system.
The newsletter backs him up, citing Dr. Wilson's work on how the courts are used to uphold white power. The system's designed to protect white people no matter what they do. Then there's the story about a pork contractor in Oregon. They're being exposed for racist practices.
Unsurprising, but still infuriating.
The newsletter uses this to show how systemic racism works in the workplace.
It's everywhere.
Connects it to Dr. Wilson's analysis of how economic control is a key tool of white supremacy. It's not just about individual prejudice, it's about how the whole system is set up to benefit white people at the expense of everyone else. Then there's this article that's so ridiculous, it's almost funny. It tries to claim that the wage gap is caused by differences in education, not racism.
Oh, please.
The newsletter calls bullshit on that, of course. Points out that it's just another way to avoid talking about the real issue. Systemic racism.
Just more smoke and mirrors.
They link it back to Dr. Wilson. The system uses education as a smokescreen to hide its true nature. It's all about maintaining the illusion of equality, while the reality is anything but.
Always deflecting. Always denying.
Then we see the growing influence of Christian nationalism in the Pacific Northwest. The newsletter sounds the alarm, saying this movement is just another form of white supremacy, just dressed up in religious clothes. Connects it to Dr. Welsing's warnings about how white supremacy often uses religion to push its agenda.
It's all about making their bigotry seem holy.
Yep.
So insidious.
And then this last one is really telling. It's about how even medical procedures like kidney testing are tainted by racial bias.
Wow. Even something as seemingly objective as healthcare is affected.
The newsletter uses this to show how deeply entrenched white supremacy is in our institutions. They connect it to Dr. Wilson's work on how white supremacy permeates every single aspect of society.
It's like a cancer that's spread everywhere.
December 13th. The meter goes up a tiny bit to 74.3%, but the news cycle. Still relentless.
What's grabbing the headlines?
The top story is about anti-racist protesters outnumbering far-right groups in demonstrations across Britain.
That's a little bit of good news, at least.
The newsletter sees it as a sign of hope. Like people are waking up and fighting back. It connects to Dr. Wilson's emphasis on the power of solidarity, collective action.
It's about coming together to disrupt the system.
Exactly. But then there's this disturbing story. Lawmakers in Ohio are pushing an anti-free speech bill, specifically targeting Muslims.
Wow. So it's like one step forward, two steps back.
The newsletter sees this as a clear example of how white supremacy will target any group it sees as a threat. It goes back to Dr. Welsing's analysis of white genetic survival panic.
They need to create an enemy to justify their bigotry.
Right, and then a WNBA star gets attacked by MAGA supporters just for commenting on white privilege.
It's like they can't even tolerate the most basic acknowledgement of reality.
The newsletter says this backlash is totally predictable. Whenever someone dares to acknowledge the truth about white supremacy, the system tries to shut them down.
Silence is golden as long as it benefits them.
Right. They link this back to Dr. Wilson. It's how the system reacts to any challenge to its power. Like they're saying, don't you dare question the status quo.
It's exhausting, honestly. But there's still glimmers of hope, right? People are organizing, resisting, building alternatives.
Absolutely. Like that story about the Muslim Women's Coalition, they're showing how powerful it can be to build your own institutions, create your own spaces of power.
It's about taking control instead of waiting for the system to change.
The newsletter celebrates this as an example of what Dr. Wilson advocated for: self-determination. Building independent structures that actually serve the needs of our communities.
It's about creating a world where we don't have to constantly fight for our basic rights.
Exactly. And then a Canadian court gets called out for its racial bias, which, the newsletter uses to remind us that white supremacy isn't just an American problem.
It's a global phenomenon.
They connect it to Dr. Welsing's work, saying these systems operate in similar ways all over the world.
It's like a global network of oppression.
And finally, we've got Trump threatening the FBI. While the GOP stays silent,
No surprise there.
the newsletter sees this as a prime example of how the system prioritizes power over principle. Every single time.
It's like they've sold their souls.
Dr. Wilson warned us about this. Those in power will happily abandon their own supposed values if it means holding on to control.
It's a bleak picture. But it's important to keep our eyes open.
Absolutely. We can't fight what we don't understand. It's like we're looking at this whole tapestry of white supremacy.
And these newsletters are helping us see how all the threads are woven together It's not just about these isolated incidents.
Right, right. It's a whole system designed to maintain white power.
Exactly. So I think it's time we dug a little deeper into the theories of Dr. Welsing and Dr. Wilson.
Yeah, good idea. The newsletters keep referencing their work.
They're clearly providing a crucial lens for understanding all of this.
Oh, for sure. These scholars were way ahead of their time.
So for those who might not be familiar with their work, can you give us a breakdown?
All right, so Dr. Welsing, she was a psychiatrist.
Okay.
And she argued that white supremacy is rooted in this deep-seated feel of genetic annihilation.
Whoa, okay. That's heavy.
She called it white genetic survival panic.
White genetic survival panic.
Yeah, she believed it drives a lot of the behaviors we see. The violence, the racism.
Both the overt and the more subtle institutional stuff.
Exactly.
Okay, so break that down for us. White genetic survival panic. What does that actually look like in the real world?
Well, basically, white people are a global minority.
Right, yeah.
So they have this subconscious fear of being outnumbered, overwhelmed by people of color.
It's like this primal anxiety about losing their power.
Yeah, their position at the top. And this fear, it manifests in all sorts of ways. Discriminatory policies, demonization of non-white cultures, you name it.
So we're talking about fear as a driving force behind a lot of these white supremacist behaviors.
Exactly.
That's pretty disturbing. And where does Dr. Wilson's work fit into all of this?
Well, he was a psychologist and a political scientist.
Okay, so different perspective.
Yeah, he focused more on the economic and political side of white supremacy.
So less about the psychological motivations and more about the systems that perpetuate it.
Right. He saw it as the system of exploitation and oppression, designed to benefit the white ruling class.
He wasn't afraid to call it out, was he?
Nope. He talked about how institutions like the justice system, education, the economy.
They're all structured to uphold white supremacy.
Exactly. It's not just individual prejudice. It's a deliberate, calculated system of control.
Okay, so we've got Dr. Welsing talking about the psychological roots of white supremacy, this fear of genetic annihilation. And then we've got Dr. Wilson analyzing the systems that maintain white power. Do these two perspectives work together?
Oh, they absolutely do. Dr. Welsing helps us understand the motivations, the fears that drive it. And then Dr. Wilson shows us how those fears translate into action, policies that create racial inequality.
So it's like a two-pronged approach. Understanding the why and then seeing how that why plays out in the real world.
Exactly. And these newsletters are using both frameworks to analyze what's happening right now.
They're helping us connect those dots between these seemingly isolated incidents and this larger system.
Right.
Okay, so let's apply this to some of the stories we discussed, like the surge in white supremacist activity after Trump's victory. How does white genetic survival panic help us understand that?
Well, think about the rhetoric Trump used, all that fear-mongering about immigration, crime, traditional values.
Just playing on those anxieties.
Exactly, about white people losing their grip.
So for those already into white supremacy, his victory was like
Permission to be more open with their bigotry.
because their anxieties were validated by someone in power.
Right. And you can see the same dynamic in other stories. The Christian nationalists calling for war.
Right.
On the surface, it seems like religious extremism. But Dr. Wilson's work helps us see it differently.
How so?
It's about power, control. Christian nationalism wants to impose this vision of America white, Christian America on everyone.
It's about controlling the narrative, the institutions, everything.
And that's exactly how Dr. Wilson understood white supremacy as a system of domination.
So they're using religion as a tool to advance their white supremacist agenda.
Exactly. It's insidious because it allows them to frame their hate as righteous, God-ordained.
Gives them a sense of moral authority. While they're promoting oppression, it's really messed up.
Totally.
And it makes me think about Rep Bowman getting attacked for speaking out.
Classic example of the system silencing dissent.
Dr. Welsing would say it's a reaction to the threat he poses.
Right. By speaking out, he challenges the status quo, triggers those fears we talked about.
And Dr. Wilson would say it's about maintaining control of the narrative.
Exactly. They can't let someone like Bowman expose the truth, inspire others to resist, so they try to discredit him, silence him.
Make an example out of him.
Exactly.
It's chilling.
Yeah.
And it's not just politics. It's the justice system, the media, healthcare. We see it everywhere.
The newsletters are showing us how pervasive it is.
Like a virus.
And that's why Dr. Welsing and Dr. Wilson are so important. They give us the tools to see the patterns, understand the forces at play.
They're giving us a roadmap for dismantling this system. But that's a conversation for another time. Man, we've covered a lot of ground here. It's pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah, no kidding. This whole deep dive into white supremacy, it's intense.
And honestly, a little bit overwhelming.
Right? You start to see it everywhere.
It's like we've opened this Pandora's box.
But we can't just sit here and wallow in despair, right?
Exactly. We've got to talk solutions. What can we actually do about all of this? Because sometimes it feels like we're just banging our heads against a wall.
I hear you. It can feel hopeless. But the thing is, these newsletters, they don't just focus on the problems. They also show us how people are fighting back.
Okay, give me some examples. What's working? What can we learn from?
Well, remember that story about the anti-racist protests in Britain?
Yeah, the ones that outnumbered the far-right marches.
Right. That's a powerful image. Shows us what collective action can achieve. We can literally drown out the hate.
It's like strength in numbers. Reminds me of what Dr. Wilson was saying about solidarity.
Exactly. Recognizing we're all in this together, using our collective power to disrupt the system.
It's about more than just being not racist. It's actively working to dismantle these systems.
Yeah, and remember that Muslim Women's Coalition? They're not waiting for the system to change. They're creating their own spaces.
Building their own institutions.
Exactly. Showing us we can create alternatives, like Dr. Wilson talked about.
Self-determination.
Yep. Building independent structures that actually serve our communities, not the white power structure. It's so inspiring. It's like they're saying, screw your system, we'll build our own. But it's not always about these big organized efforts, right? What about those individuals who are just speaking truth to power, even when it's risky?
That's crucial too. Look at Rep Bowman. He's facing a ton of backlash, but he's not backing down. And that's what we need, people willing to speak the truth.
Like Dr. Welsing said, we have to name the problem.
Call it out.
Yeah.
Because silence, it only benefits the oppressor. But it's not always about these grand gestures either.
What about those smaller, everyday acts of resistance? Do those matter?
They matter a lot. It's about being conscious, making choices that disrupt the system.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Supporting businesses owned by people of color, calling out racist jokes when you hear them, educating yourself, educating others.
It's about understanding that we all have a part to play.
Exactly, no matter how small it seems.
And recognizing that this fight is interconnected. Yeah, the fight against white supremacy is a fight for everyone's liberation. Because this system, it harms us all, even those who seem to benefit from it. In the short term, anyway.
Well said. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a sense of hope and a call to action.
Yes.
Don't despair. Get informed. Get involved. Get active. This is a fight we can win.
But only if we work together.
And that's a wrap for this week's Deep Dive. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you for tuning in to the Good White Folks podcast. Be sure to visit us at planetarychess.org to explore more content and subscribe to our monthly newsletter. For those who want to stay ahead, join our paid tier for just $10 a month and receive daily state of white supremacy alerts, Monday through Friday. Stay informed, stay empowered, and let's dismantle together.